She came down for coffee the next morning, the way she always did. Same robe, hair still loose from sleep. And for 1/2 second, standing there in the kitchen doorway, I watched her expect an ordinary morning. That 1/2 second is the last one I ever saw her have. I had not slept much the night before, if I am honest with you, not because I doubted what I was about to do, but because a part of me, the part that had loved her for 18 years without a single calculation, kept quietly hoping the morning would somehow arrive differently than I had planned it. It did not. Mornings, I have learned, do not care what you hope for. They only care what you have already decided. The papers were already on the table, not a threat, not a draft. Filed, signed, notarized, sitting right next to her coffee cup, exactly where I had placed them before sunrise, the edges squared perfectly with the corner of the table, the way I imagine Reyes herself would have arranged them. I had not shouted the night before. I had not given her time to plan a graceful exit on her own terms, the way I strongly suspected she was already quietly working toward, somewhere behind that calm face she had been wearing for 2 days. I had simply moved first. She picked up the folder before she picked up her coffee. I watched her read the first page twice. The way you read something you are hoping will say something different the second time. It did not. Reyes had made sure of that. Every asset, every account, every line was already exactly where it needed to be. Filed with the county the previous afternoon, while Caroline was upstairs, packing what she believed, in that quiet and private way she believed most things, was an unhurried decision entirely her own to control. I want to tell you something about Reyes here, because it matters to how calm that morning actually was. 2 nights earlier, she had called me at home, late, and told me something I have not forgotten. She said that the difference between a messy divorce and a clean one is almost never the amount of money involved. It is almost always the amount of time one side gives the other to prepare a story. She told me that Caroline, given even 3 or 4 days of warning, was clever enough to soften the record, to plant small seeds with friends and family about who had really failed whom. Reyes told me the kindest thing I could do for both of us was to remove the option of a slow, curated goodbye and replace it with a fast, honest one. So I did. She asked me how long I had planned this. I told her the truth. I had not planned it for long. I had simply stopped waiting. The moment I understood that every day I gave her to prepare her own version of events was a day she might use to move something, hide something, or rewrite the story for whoever she told it to first. I was not interested in being outmaneuvered twice, in one marriage. She tried, for a while, the way people do when they are still hoping the ground might shift back in their favor. She said we could still work something out, quietly, without lawyers, without this much paperwork. She said it the way she used to negotiate everything in our marriage, gently, reasonably, in a tone designed to make refusal feel unkind. I told her Reyes had already accounted for that possibility too. Everything in the filing was fair, fully within what the law protected for her, but none of it was negotiable in a kitchen over coffee. I want to tell you what she said next, because it is the sentence I have thought about most since that morning. She asked if I had ever loved her at all, or if I had simply been waiting, patiently, for a reason to end things on my own terms. I told her the truth. I had loved her completely, for 18 years, without a single calculation. The calculating only started the day she gave me a reason to need it. She was quiet for a long moment after that. I watched her look down at the folder again, not reading it this time, just holding it. The way you hold something heavy you have not yet decided where to put down. The phone rang twice while she packed. I did not answer it, but I heard the voicemail come through the machine in the hallway, the old one we had never bothered replacing. It was her sister, Margaret, asking if the rumor she had heard from a mutual friend was true. Caroline stood very still in the hallway when she heard that message play, and I understood, watching her, that the story had already begun to travel faster than either of us controlled. Reyes had been right about that too, though not quite in the direction either of us expected. It was not me who had spoken. It was simply that filings, once made public, do not stay quiet for long in a town this size. She packed the rest of that day. I did not help her, and I did not stop her. I sat in the study with the door open, not to watch her, but so she would know I was not hiding from what was happening in my own house. I could hear her moving through the bedroom, opening drawers, the particular sound of hangers sliding across a closet rod, a sound I had heard 10,000 times before, and would now, for the rest of my life, associate only with that single afternoon. 6 boxes. 18 years, reduced to 6 boxes and a garment bag, carried out one at a time to a car I had once helped her choose, in a parking lot on a Saturday, laughing about the color. I remember standing in the driveway that day, years ago, telling her the blue one suited her better than the silver. I do not know why that memory came back to me while I watched her load boxes into that same car. Grief, I have learned, does not announce which memories it intends to visit. It simply arrives with whichever one it chooses. Around box 4, she stopped, and she asked if she could take the small clock from the mantel, the one her grandmother had given us as a wedding gift. It was, technically, part of the household property, and technically mine to decide. I told her to take it. Some things are not worth protecting simply because you are allowed to. I have never regretted that decision, small as it was. Before she left, she stopped in the doorway, the same doorway where I had watched her expect an ordinary morning less than 12 hours earlier. She asked if I was going to tell people what really happened. I told her I would not need to. The filing was public record now. The truth did not require my help to travel. She nodded slowly, and for just a moment I saw something in her face that was not calculation, not performance, not even sadness exactly. It looked almost like relief. I have thought about that expression many times since, and the closest I can come to understanding it is this. Some part of her had also been tired of holding up a version of our life that had already quietly ended long before I found the room, the watch, the robes. Discovery, I think, is sometimes simply the moment two people finally stop pretending together. She drove away a little after 4 in the afternoon. I stood in the driveway and watched the car turn at the end of the street. The same corner she had turned 1,000 ordinary times before, going to the store, picking up her sister, driving to the very meetings I would later learn were never meetings at all. I watched until the car was out of sight, and then I went back inside. The house was different immediately. Not empty exactly, still fully furnished, still every lamp in its place. Every photograph still on the wall, because we had not yet had the harder conversation about which of those photographs would eventually come down. But different in the way a held breath is different from an exhale. I stood in the kitchen for a long time afterward, looking at the same table where the papers had sat that morning, now empty, except for 2 coffee cups. Hers still half full. Going cold. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant. I did not. I felt something closer to the quiet that comes after a long job is finally finished, the kind of tired that has nothing left to prove. I sat down at that table, alone, for the first time in 18 years, and I did not immediately clean up the cups. I simply sat there, in the particular silence of a house that has just changed ownership of more than its deed, and let myself feel exactly as much as I could stand to feel, and not 1 degree more. 18 years does not end with fireworks. It ends with an empty table, and a house that is, for the first time in a very long time, entirely and only yours. That night, I called Reyes to tell her it was done. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then she told me something I did not expect. She said that in her experience, the hardest part was never the filing, never the papers, never even the conversation itself. The hardest part, she said, was the first ordinary evening afterward. The first time you sit down to a silence that used to be filled with someone else's voice and have to decide for yourself what you are going to do with it. I did not have an answer for her that night. I sat on the back porch for a long while after we hung up, the way Caroline and I used to sit together most evenings, except now there was only one chair pulled close enough to matter, and I did not bother moving the second one. I remember thinking that the yard looked exactly the same as it had the night before. The same fence line, the same tired old maple tree Caroline had wanted to cut down for years, and I had always talked her out of. And it struck me, sitting there, how strange it is that a house can change everything about what it means to live inside it, while changing nothing at all about how it looks from the outside. I thought, for a while, about her father. He had passed 6 years earlier, a quiet, careful man who had never fully trusted me, not out of dislike, but out of a kind of old-fashioned caution that made him slow to trust anyone with his daughter. I remembered a conversation we had once, at our wedding, of all places, when he pulled me aside near the bar and told me, in that flat, unemotional way he said most important things, that a marriage is only as strong as what happens in it when no one else is watching. I had nodded politely that night, the way you nod at any piece of advice from an older man at a wedding, without really absorbing it. I understood it fully, for the first time, sitting alone on that porch 18 years later, with the papers already filed and the boxes already gone. I want to tell you about the note Reyes had included in the filing folder, tucked behind the last page, that I did not find until later that evening. It was short, handwritten, not part of any official document. It said only this, that clean endings are rare, and that I should not mistake the absence of chaos for the absence of grief. She told me to expect the second feeling to arrive later than the first, usually once the adrenaline of the decision itself had worn off. And she was right, almost to the hour. Around midnight, sitting in that same kitchen, staring at the 2 cups I still had not washed. The grief finally arrived, quiet and enormous, the way weather arrives after a long stretch of unnatural calm. I did not call anyone that night. I did not want comfort yet, and I did not trust myself to explain what I was actually feeling, which was not regret exactly, and not relief exactly, but something more complicated sitting underneath both of those, a kind of mourning, I think. For the version of my life I had believed I was living for 18 years, a version that had never technically existed the way I thought it had. The next morning, the phone calls started. First Margaret, Caroline's sister, leaving a message I did not return that day. Then, surprisingly, a name I had not heard in almost a decade, Caroline's mother's oldest friend, a woman named Patricia, who had been at our wedding and had not spoken to me directly since. I did not know, standing in that kitchen listening to the machine fill with voices from a part of my life I thought had quietly faded years ago, that one of those calls would turn into the conversation I least expected to have, the one I want to tell you about next, because it changed how I understood everything that had happened, not just in the last 10 days, but in the 18 years before them. That is the next part of this story.